In most Monster Hunter games, the monsters aren't picked at random. Whilst in earlier generations for sure, there was a hard cap on how many choices there could actually be made. But as the series progressed, its rosters got more and more meaningful. So let's meander through the games to take a look at who made the cut. The first Monster Hunter game doesn't exactly have a stunning reputation among the community, often remarked as unfinished, unplayable, or not worth playing. The merits of such judgment will be weighed later, but I will say that it's too harsh. Say what you will about a lot of the game and its clunkiness and brutality on the player, but the Wyvern roster of the game and its ingenuity is genuinely very commendable. With only really 2 skeletons to use, 3 if you're immensely generous and count the pig skeleton too, being the raptor bird wyvern one and the flying wyvern one, also repossessed for the larger bird wyverns too, then they generally did get blood from a stone. The amount of mileage they get out of the latter skeleton without repeating itself is genuinely impressive. Kezu, Rathalos, Monoblos, Cephadrome and Gypsaros are all significantly different fights. Just how fun some of these fights are is a different question, but the fact there's such a notable separation in vibe is highly commendable. Differences in design lead to differences in movement that lead to a difference in moveset, with burrowing, flying, swimming, running and wall crawling often providing the core around with which a fight and identity is built. With ecological rendition of typical fire-breathing dragon, cave leech, chicken, sand shark and flightless prehistoric dragon, all being the bricks from which the monsters are built from. This is not to say the whole roster is a success in this regard, and the raptorial bird wyverns are essentially reskins of Velocidrome, who is just a giant Velociprey, much as Diablos is a reskin of Monoblos. But the fact that one skeleton essentially carries the entire game without just feeling like the same fight 15 times is impressive. And even when movesets overlap heavily, there's still a clear and concerted effort to create difference, with Gypsaros's gimmicks and focus on stamina not entirely separating him from feeling like poisonous Kutku, but do enough that it's very clear that he's not just a feckless reskin. And the same with the lumbering Gravios essentially being a gassy, laser-wielding Bloss Wyvern in one. Overall, One's roster is a success for both the first game and a game that was literally created to test online multiplayer assets. Looking back, it really is funny to think after languishing for years it would become Capcom's golden goose. But I think the clear passion in the world and roster do show why it managed to accrue such a loyal, albeit small, fanbase back in the day. As is known, Monster Hunter went from a traditional dime-a-dozen fantasy to focusing more on the monsters, and asking what if they were living things in a natural world not so removed from our own. And as said, much of the difference that makes One's roster work comes from them starting with a unique idea that necessitated differences from each other, that then led to different fights. Fight and design aren't separate matters to be discussed, but rather entwined topics. The goal of any sequel should be to ask what the first did well, and use it as a jumping off point, and identify what didn't go well and try to mitigate or remove that. And second gen succeeds at the former, and partially at the latter. While second gen not only failed to remove a lot of the jank holding the series back, but it also made DOS brutally hard to the point of agony. However, it did recognise that the monsters were the real stars, and that the beautiful maps were generally a success too, usually looking quite fantastic for the time. But crucially, it recognised it couldn't just make another roster full of flying wyverns and reptiles, and so expanded the diversity considerably with crabs, monkeys and elder dragons that weren't sealed behind online play. Whilst many first-gen wyverns still succeed today, and were palatable even then, their overall ball plan meant they didn't use the forelimbs to attack, or really do much outside of movement. As such, second gen feels like it had a big influence on striking and grasping monsters, with movesets now being filled with fists, claws and chelicerae, and less charging and running, with one often having a lot of bullfight elements in much of its combat. This made the newcomers a very refreshing change, with a series of decent fights more centered around close-quarter combat, when the incredibly concentrated wyverns were both diversified further with the pseudo-wyverns, and then diluted with the generally pretty decent second-gen additions. At the end of it all, Freedom Unite does wind up having one of the best rosters in the series. Monsters of the 2 generations coalesce very well, with Kongalala, Daimyo and Kutku all providing the same ideas across multiple families. of a goofy, soft pink entry point to an overall dangerous and significant class. Similarly, like the evolutions of Pokemon, the evolutions of crab, monkey and bird just lead to a very pleasing feeling of progression as you level up through them. The movesets are similar, but never the same, as the difficulty increases as they move from dopey pink starters to increasingly harsher, more competent and more predatory monsters. With some of the best gear in the game too, you'll be grinding them a lot, so it's good that they're an enjoyable set. Similarly, once the Elders are reached, the trio of Teostra, Chameleos and Kushala feed into each other nicely, with each dragon being weak to the other's element, and this being reflected in the gear too, each one giving the best tools to take the other down. Tigrex and Nagakuga both slot into the Apex role, not that it was called as such back then, and 2nd gen generally feels like it places the Flying Wyverns as the top dogs in any ecosystem, with Tigrex spreading their dominion even to the snowy mountains. The crabs feel like an interesting commentary on this too, as they try to imitate the wyverns through the skulls they gather. Shogun's water beam is a poor imitation of Gravios's fire, as befits someone the rank below the stone wyvern. And Daimyo's strongest attacks are when it tries to imitate Monoblos. The crabs don't just set each other up, they set up the wyverns they borrow from as well. That similarly leads to a pleasing feeling of development that is ultimately lost in Sunbreak when both appear without their skull's owners. As such, Freedom Unite was a bestseller, and is still widely beloved by the fanbase. Famed for its difficulty, but still probably being the easiest game in the series at the time, with a giant roster that it still managed to interweave in interesting ways, and miraculously managed to not collapse its structure, outside perhaps some irrelevant colour swap subspecies. Many wondered where the series would go next. So then we come to Monster Hunter Tri. Beloved by the fanbase that started with it, but a disappointment to many who were part of the fandom before, a look at Tri's roster shows why both parties had their viewpoints. As of Freedom Unite, the games had done nothing but grow, with the old species staying as the new ones were added on. Tri actually cutting a lot of the cast led to much displeasure in and out of the game. Stemming from a small roster, the fear old monsters had been kicked for good, a game that felt incomplete, and the fact it didn't help that a lot of the newcomers had resemblances to old monsters, like Barioth to the Pseudo-Wyverns, Giganox to Kezu, or Uragan to Gravios. Whilst much of this dust did settle sometime later, some of the initial complaints about Tri do hold water. There's no way around the fact the roster is tiny, and can feel very incomplete, especially for a game so far into the series and coming off the back of Freedom Unite. For the first game to really kick the ecological aspects and map interactions up a notch, a lot of its maps feel relatively barren in terms of their cast list. Whilst there is some attempt to spread monsters across multiple areas, it's clear really who is intended to go where. With Great Jaggi, Kurapiko, Baroth, Rathian and Diablos, the Sandy Plains comes out reasonably strong, but the Tundra only just manages to scrape together a food chain with Great Baggy, Giganox and Barioth. The Volcano is just a random spread of high-powered monsters, get used to that by the way, and the Flooded Forest is essentially just Goebel's private map. In a progression sense, Tri falls short too. It has a high rank, but it also may as well not. Other than endlessly fighting Deviljho, there isn't really much need for it to even have one, for all the new content it doesn't unlock. It's easy to put on rose-tinted spectacles for Tri, but there are reasons outside of it being exiled to the Nintendo Wii as to why it sold comparatively poorly. But with all of that said, it's also immensely clear as to why Tri stays in the hearts of so many. With a small roster, everyone gets a lot of attention, and other than the Raptors and obviously the Wraths, even with monsters that share families and animation rigs, they're all very distinguished from one another. Whilst one had some success with this in the Flying Wyvern skeleton, a broader skeleton choice increases this further, but extends even further still to interacting with the map and each other in new ways. Between map gimmicks like Uragan's rolling, Agnacta's ceiling burrowing, or Barioth and Giganox's wall and cave jumping, to combat gimmicks like Kurapiko's call-ins and Goebel's bag of tricks, and all of this distinction is really baked into the gameplay as well as appearance. Whilst fledgling ideas similar to this were present in earlier monsters, this was the first time essentially everyone got such bespoke features, and everyone has at least one fun and memorable little gimmick. Gameplay-wise, it all leads to a very solid group. Other than the Raptors again, no two monsters ever feel like they have the same fight, and crucially for the less tangible aspects of the game, The monsters are presented as differently as they fight. Again, one succeeded to a degree in separating its monsters, but there was still a fair amount of sound design overlap and more noticeable asset reuse. With interesting and generally bespoke ecology and design, each monster has a different silhouette as form befits function. Agnacta and Lagiacrus are both leviathans, but Agnacta displays vertically with its beak and erect fins, whereas Lagiacrus is much more horizontal with its hood and broader profile. Ludroth's bulbous mane and unornamented body set it apart, and you can't confuse Gobel for anything else. The small Baroth has a big head with a prominence on the top, then a small tail. The huge Deviljho has the opposite, and then Uragan is chunky and lumpy all over. And this continues excellently to sound design. Be it Giganox's squish walking and serial killer breathing in the caves, Uragan's creaking and groaning, or Agnacta's clacking among the rest. Every cast member of Tri has received a lot of attention and a lot of effort to make them stand out from each other, and just to make them feel incredibly characterful too. There's generally just so much effort that isn't just for gameplay, that's meant to make them feel like living things with distinct personalities that never spill over into anthropomorphizing. When combined with story, soundtrack and progression, it all leads to Tri having a very unique feel that no Monster Hunter game has really captured since. So as DLC and Ultimate Editions can do, the new cast members of Portable 3rd and 3 Ultimate provide a mixed bag. Most notably, the Depauperate Flooded Forest is greatly embellished with Duramboros, Nagakuga, Great Roggy and Crimson Kurapiko, even getting a second water fight in Green Plesioth, and now feels much more like a proper and well-established map full of fitting monsters, with the jungle map now getting a mossy old buffalo, black panther, tropical bird and poison dart frog raptor. But Brachydios just adds yet another high-powered monster to the volcano, and the tundra for some reason, and a lot of other subspecies are middling at best or essentially 3rd-gen palette swaps. The tundra is cursed rather than blessed by Jade Baroth and Glacial Agnacta, as is the desert by Sand Barioth and Rust Duramboros, who both add little to an already well-stocked map, but at least Nibelsnarf manages to complement the existing roster. And if not necessarily a comment on the roster, it'd be remiss to note how little 3 Ultimate actually cares for Tri's story, as it adds an even older and rarer Sayadeus variant that it allows the player to just kill in cold blood. The struggle of which game has the better roster will ultimately come down to vibes versus content, and in this case content probably does win, due to how barebones Tri was, and how a lot of 3U's newcomers are still likely the first time they're fought by many. And a fair few do actually add very positively to the game as well. For all the bloat it adds, Portable 3rd and 3 Ultimate do patch up a lot of Tri's holes, at the cost of its unique atmosphere. And for 4th gen, I generally consider things to be at their lowest point, which is probably a surprising statement for a game so beloved. Whilst I don't dislike 4U, and did used to be of the typical opinion that it's the best old-gen Monster Hunter some years ago, I do think it's a game that wins on its averages rather than its strengths. 4U does everything at about a 7 or 8, except for its god-awful maps, whereas other games often have a specific focus that reaches a 10, but with other aspects that are either a 4 or 5, either in general or from creating the 10 factor. If you really love Monster Hunter, you'll of course want the complete package, but chances are a game that isn't 4U will have a 10 factor that makes it a semantic favourite, and this applies to the roster as well. 4U essentially replays a lot of Freedom Unite's highlights, sharing much of the same roster, but winds up diluting much of the feelings of progression Freedom Unite made due to having such a broad spread of monsters. And I think diluted is the word for 4U's roster. It's so expansive it never really manages to maintain coherent themes like earlier ones. Everything is just generally all over the place in a game saturated with content. And whilst the monsters aren't bad, and some all-time classics like Seregios and Ursula are introduced here, many returners and newcomers don't feel like they get as much attention as prior games with focused rosters. And as such, many just get lost in the numbers. Part of these feelings do stem from the fact I've never played Base 4, and only 4U. Base 4 may be better structured, and so my thoughts on it may change if I did. And I still do think some of 4 Ultimate's aspects are quite interesting. Centering essentially a whole expansion around one biome with the desert is something, and I actually think it pulls it off more successfully than Iceborne, who only wound up giving the Hoarfrost a small handful of actually bespoke monsters, in their overbearing lust to make half the new content invaders. But the nadir truly comes with Generations Ultimate, and there's very little to say here and very little positive, unless you just like a lot of content, because that's all Generations really is. It's essentially just, here are some monsters, with a complete absence of structure or intent. On semantics, earlier I said whether or not first gen is worth playing. After all, you can fight first gen Kutku in a first gen map with a first gen weapon against first gen music in the final second gen game of the series, Freedom Unite. But will it be the same? And with how portable and mainline structure their games and the roster progressions? Probably not. You will be better prepared in second gen, and Kutku won't be quite as walling an experience. He just won't be as big a deal, and thus the vibes will be completely different. Vibes is a pretty informal term, but then a lot of the experience given by any Monster Hunter game will be both relatively intangible and personal. When talking about monsters, this is one point where I really divert from most of the fanbase in that I feel the base game is infinitely more worthwhile as a title than the Ultimate/DLC edition nowadays. And roster structure is a big part of that. Everything in the base game is typically a much more tailored experience with a clear goal, and it shows. Ultimate editions, whilst they can add content sometimes needed, also stuff in a lot of content not necessarily needed, and with little care. It almost makes the whole new area vibe World and Wilds try to go for pointless, and that half of the fauna of the old world did and is inevitably going to wind up there anyway too. I've already fought most of the flagships in a dozen games now, and with DLC add-ons having none of the care of the base game, I'm rarely interested in doing so again for another phoned-in performance. As in this regard, I essentially don't count any appearance in Generations Ultimate as worth talking about in that monsters span in the series, where quite literally no monster is at its best, no one is updated, no one has their map interactions, but everyone is stuffed in there anyways for the sake of bragging about roster size. When we get to 5th gen and onwards, rosters also start getting even more interesting. With greater technology to bring the world to life, combined with a large backlog of monsters to draw from, the choices of who goes where start to mean even more. World's roster has occasionally come under criticism, with the main one levied that it lacks skeletal diversity, and this isn't wrong, but can also feel like a churlish remark considering Tri is so beloved at the same amount of skeletons, only if you consider the singular final boss Alatrion. The other parallel complaints are either world has too many elders, too many lizards, or too many flying wyverns. The lizard comment I find similarly churlish, considering how we quite literally had one fanged wyvern beforehand, and world patches up a severely neglected class. Similarly, the flying wyverns remark is one often made about the series too, but frankly I think they're a genre of monsters that's only continued to keep giving. Seregios, Basiljuice, Legiana, Raidau, all of the new flying wyverns are brilliant, and well-differentiated monsters that satisfy on every level. And whilst Astalos doesn't quite match his peers, he's also generally on the better side of the series monsters list than the worse. Because at the end of the day, I think roster quality is more important than diversity. Both is good, best in fact, and that's why you can make a real argument at Wilds having the best roster in a game to date. But I'd much rather have a game comprised entirely of the same class, used in different and interesting ways, than the worst fight from every skeleton, which is as good as a segue to Monster Hunter Rise as you could ask for. As I'm fairly certain if you took every raptor and early game bear and shot them behind the back of the woodshed, Rise would be improved immensely as a game, especially the raptors. As in general, for the first half of its roster, Rise doesn't really seem to know what it's doing. In buffing Anjanath to Apex, it then has a huge amount of Raptor and Kutku tier monsters, some of which it artificially buffs to serve as mid-tiers, that overall leads to a weak start to things. When Rise gets to the Apexes it really takes off, but it spends a very long and uninteresting time taxiing on the runway first. Whilst most of Rise's returning Apexes are either okay, or as good as their last portable appearance, which is to say crap, Rathalos is arguably at its best until Wilds. And the new Apexes all generally manage to be a pretty interesting bunch, with Almadron and Ragnar Kadaki really being notable highlights too. Whilst Basiljuice isn't as good as World, it is still fairly passable, and the reasonably decent Elder Trio with many people's favourite rendition of Kushala also managed to make sure that once Rise has taken off, it actually manages to stay aloft too. I think it is worth noting Ichinose's talents seem most focused when at the Apex level, whether it be that he just likes this portion of the game, or it's from years of being constrained to making apexes and final bosses only. Whilst many of Ichinose's early game monsters can span an unfun valley between uninteresting and awful, just about all of his apexes are near universally well received, and highly regarded monsters with good fights, and can often break free from Portable too. Garuga, Zenoga, Tigrex and Mizutsune have been readily accepted by mainline base games, and Glavenus made an excellent addition to Iceborne. Interesting too is his seeming reluctance to make elders outside of final bosses, with no basic elders coming from his games. So to look at Ichinose's strengths, it's little surprise Rise had all its meat in the tail end. And to be fair to Rise, its janky start isn't something unique to it. A lot of the monsters it uses for its intro are either returners who are never all that good when new, again the bears and the raptors, or old world monsters who are just better in their original game. With the care and attention to detail put into them, they're just generally better in world, which is a game that generally starts off a lot stronger by front-loading the game with mainly new content, and also Baroth, who's still enjoyable. But I've said before that I find World has a bit of a mid-game slump, and that neatly brings us to a part of any roster the series has gone back and forth with, the mid-tiers, or rather the Rathian/Anjanath tiers. This role is often contentious as only a few monsters seem to stay there for long, often being downgraded to Kutku tier as Cephadrome and Gypsyros were, as the original two Anjanath tiers, or getting upgraded to Apex tier as Rise Anjanath bizarrely was. As rosters get larger, this role is often the one that feels the most muddled and least clear, with Foryu and Gens just feeling like a lot of indefinite Kutku tiers until the first Apex. When we get to World, despite some of the most clearest defined mid-tiers, they still feel distinctly limp outside of Anjanath. So what does Anjanath do differently? And how is this then applied to World's roster too? And it seems to be the structure of its fight and its role. In Rise, Anjanath just uses fire whenever, but in World it's far more of a build-up, with Anjanath's enrage and fire-embellished bites, until Anjanath finally releases a flame jet that's the strongest move encountered in the game at that point, and often overcomes the player's armor. It's the gradual rise in power and damage output until the attaining of an enraged state, and the release of a super attack that's very damaging. Monsters with enrages and super moves aren't new, but with most Apex monsters it's much more of an instant switch. With many of Wild's Monsters Inc., the contrast comes from their normal state to their enraged one where they embrace the element of their inclemency. To gradually do so would diminish the drama of the change. Whilst this may seem less interesting gameplay-wise, it is something of a statement on power. Mid-tiers need to warm up. Apexes can leap right into the action. So similarly, the Anjanath-style gradual build-up is given to the new mid-tiers instead. Ajarakan is gradually building friction until it can fully ignite, and then builds towards its Mega Dragon Ball dive. Balahara spits more and more bile until both its Mega Bile Blast or its full-body Tail Drill launch. Dosh accumulates wounds that enrage it, and then they all split open again, turning it into a foaming glass cannon as it does its strongest moves like the table flip. On top of this, some often argue that some mid-tiers should really be apexes, and looking into them, that feels like the point. It seems the best mid-tiers are ones where you essentially make a convincing apex, and then make it a mid-tier through ecological or behavioural reasons instead. Indeed, Anjanath, Deshagama and Ajarakan are all defined through their desire for the ecological throne. Anjanath bullies everyone to try and install itself as king, and is keen but unable to actually defeat Rathalos. He imitates Rathalos's wings but ultimately cannot fly, and that makes all the difference in their turf war. In a while the cat is away the mouse will play situation, Ajarakan essentially serves as the house sitter apex until Nuudra comes up from the depths and dispels an entire troop at once despite their objections. Ajarakan lusts for friction and fire to achieve its most powerful state, but the disparity in power is shown when Nuudra uses this fire to burn Ajarakan, showing that his powers are just small potatoes in comparison. Deshagma do pluck up the courage as a group to try and invade the plains, and are destroyed by the resident monsters in the attempt. Whilst we do never properly get Alpha Deshagama versus Raidou in a turf war, the game provides enough of an answer as to who wins. Past mid-tiers could often just feel like overpowered Kutku tiers, or just had a bit of a flat fight that never really broke free from feeling like a strong Kutku tier, or an artificially weak apex. Radovan, despite arguably being the best Uragan fight-wise, feels a bit like this especially. Both Gravios and Uragan have their weaker forms, with Bessarios specifically being designed and created as a juvenile, and therefore weaker individual which is reflected in its fight. But Radovan is much more similar to Uragan, and still retains a lot of what is supposed to make Uragan feel strong, just coming across as an oddly nerfed equivalent instead. When World and Wilds reach their apexes though, things do rise to another peak. In World, Rathalos is also probably the best he'd been at that point, Diablos is arguably at its best, and Legiana and Odogron especially are excellent new additions, the latter arguably being World and possibly 5th Gen's best newcomer. In Wilds, with its 4 inclemency apexes getting some of the best presentation of any monsters in the series so far, the game largely revolves around them and Arkveld, and the former with how they interact with the map and its inclemency. As such, Wilds is very much the game of the apexes, much more so than any other, and they're some of the best monsters to date, but perhaps at the cost of some of the lesser beasts. Without such flashiness and inclemencies to utilise, World's monsters and apexes only really had other monsters to display a lot of their environments with. Despite the fact essentially all of World's story revolves around elders, its theme of birth and death and having Nurg as its flagship, it's really the smaller monsters in World that very much sell it. The elders still nudge the story along, but really it's the wyverns who are the real stars. As such, a lot of who they are comes from their interactions. Anjanath is defined by his bullying of smaller monsters, and then King Rathalos is defined as being above everyone else in his ivory tower, only smacking Anjanath when he tries to usurp him. The Wildspire's 3 lords are all trying to expand their respective territories in the Wildspire, when really they're just tenants in Diablos' desert, who thrashes 2 of them when they get in his way. Odogaron likes to think of himself as king, but is no match for a rare resident and environmental elder, but then also shows he's an anomaly in the Highlands by overcoming their native defences due to having his own specialisations, except for Legiana, who is king of the Highlands with how it uses the wind, showcasing this in how it batters Palumu before even laying a talon on it. World still has the best and best structured turf wars, as they really tell stories in the maps and about the monsters, rather than just being for aura and hype. This is also why the Elders' Recess feels very limp in comparison to the other maps. Outside of the Elders, it's 3 monsters who essentially keep to themselves, and don't do very much in regard to one another. Even if we're told Lavazioth and Uragan will sometimes fight, we don't see it. When it comes to Deviljho, much of World and its ideals make you realise this really was the ideal game for it. A lot of World does revolve around consumption, with one map being a giant stomach, its flagship being defined by its diet, and its handshake starter by its gluttony. Even its final boss revolves around consumption as it draws in the energy of other elders. So the World Eater is an obvious choice for the first DLC, where he's now also named the Food Chain Dominator, and proceeds to do just that against the various apexes. But we also see some of the early ideas for Wilds in Worlds too, in regards to apexes and their maps. Wildspire Apex Diablos is the only monster that can activate the Sand Trap, and Legiana is Apex of the Highlands due to its ability to utilise the wind currents better than anyone else. There is some notion of apexes being the best fit for their environments already on display, that leads to their success. You can argue how well you think the Highlands executed that idea, but on the topic of comparing World to Wilds, I do think it may be the better option when we consider the whole roster and not just the apexes. As I just said earlier, it'd be wrong to say the apexes are the only good monsters in Wilds, with its brilliant mid-tiers. But at the same time, some of the lower ranks can feel a bit forgotten in comparison, when it comes to the maps and the inclemencies. Rather than a sliding scale of utilisation and dominance, as is the case in the Highlands with how its residents utilise wind, it's much more the apexes handle the inclemency and are kings of their maps, and everyone else gets battered by it or is indifferent to it regardless of rank. Rathian or Deshagama doesn't handle the apex any better than, say, Lalabarina. In comparison, they just don't get as much to do, and often don't feel as well realised as monsters from the lower ranks of earlier games, despite their quality in other areas. Some monsters do get interesting things to do in the maps, like Lala's Nest and Balahara being the most successfully implemented Sandstorm to date, with both standing out nicely. But some other monsters can fall a bit flat in comparison, If you're hoping for Chatacabra to do anything as interesting as Great Jagras eating a whole Aptonoth and then feeding its pack, you'd be disappointed. And likewise if you wanted to see Chemetries do anything as interesting as cool as egg runs. A concern often about mainline games is that they're small, with the bespoke rosters resulting in less monsters. And while it's true enough of One and Try, I actually disagree with later games. World launched with 30 monsters, and Wilds with 29. And I actually think this is fine, but I don't think 30 monsters is ungenerous at all. That's enough for 5 bespoke monsters per map, an Elder Trio or equivalent of your choice, and 2 invaders as well. To say nothing of the 4 to 5 to come in title updates after. That's a pretty solid amount of monsters, and the hypothetical placement of them is why it sounds like a lot, because that's not what mainline games tend to do. Takuda has a bit of a bad habit of putting a lot in some maps and then next to nothing in others. The Coral Highlands is one such example, only getting 3 bespoke monsters and then visits from Odogaron as well, while the Ancient Forest had a solid 5 monsters to be getting on with, and then still felt the need to steal Kulayaku from the Wildspar as well, with visits from both Azure and Kushala from the Recess too. This is also present in Wilds, with the Ice Shard Cliffs feeling a little bare unless they have a ton of bird wyverns that don't really feel like they belong there as well. There is also the ruins of Wyveria only getting Shaywu and the Guardians, and then instead having the runoff from other maps. But in this case it's the add-ons being the problem rather than the OCs, as I think this really harms the presentation of Wyveria too. A map being the ruins of a civilization overrun by its feral bioweapons, and a weird squid who showed up to specialise in eating them, is a lot more interesting and unique than stuffing half the rest of the roster in there with no explanation as to how they survive, or differ, or do anything really. Wild's high rank also stands out here a bit as well. The old monsters populating it are probably the best renditions of them to date, but outside of Kutku, Gore and the path to fighting it, they're essentially given no fanfare, story involvement or ecological build-up, which, after past games' treatments of equivalent monsters like Rathalos or Diabolos, as well as the way the new content in Gore are built up, do make them feel oddly listless. The fights are good, and many of said returners are at their best yet, but the monsters themselves feel disconnected or forgotten. So I don't think mainline games necessarily have small rosters, but they just feel that way because the monsters can sometimes be very unevenly distributed between the maps and / story progression, resulting in you spending less time in some maps than others, and giving the feeling the game doesn't have as much content as it actually does. To return to an earlier point, does the new content of the DLC save them in this regard? And yesn't. I think a big chunk of this hinges on what the original game was both trying to do on macro and micro levels. Whilst I don't think Iceborne Nagakuga is great, I think it's a good choice for the Ancient Forest, but I don't think so for the Coral Highlands, nor any newcomers for that matter. Except for you though, Coral Pukey, you're great. The Highlands was trying to be a unique map with its own theme, and Nagakuga, Zenogre and the Invaders simply blunder in and ignore that with none of the storytelling and turf wars Odo does it with. Some could make the argument the new monsters give more things to do, and so improve the Highlands as a map. But do they? They do nothing unique in the map they don't already do in a map better suited to them, have sparse lore tying them to it, no new or unique interactions or turf wars. Really, they don't add anything because they don't do anything new in the map. What they do, however, is mitigate the things the Highlands actually had going for it, its concept and its uniqueness in that regard. I think if I could make my own director's cut of Iceborne, it'd be my favourite game, but its scattershot approach to returners and invaders undoes a lot of the bespoke feel World delivered. While it's not as bad as 4th gen, but also not as in dire need for content as Try, Iceborne generally teeters back and forth depending on the quality of each edition. World's ideals aren't entirely abandoned. The Hoarfrost generally does come out as an okay map, but a lot of the returners and invaders can feel frustratingly sloppy with how unnecessary their ranges are. With Sunbreak, the less bespoke focus of the initial game means Sunbreak doesn't have anything real to interfere with, outside of the general yokai theme. After Daimyo is used to ease the player in, this is quickly abandoned, and the game goes for a more Western Gothic theme, ending in a successful culmination with Geismagorm, and also a return to the portable third references with Amatsu too. But I also think in 5th gen things can get a bit sloppy as they go on. Iceborne seems to start with the nice idea of the apex and the rival, with the bulk of the returners being apexes unlike Sunbreak, and so pitting them against the local rival from the base game. This starts and continues nicely with Rathalos vs Nargacuga, Diablos vs Glavenus, and Tigrex vs Odogaron. Starts to wobble when Odogaron then doubles as Legiana's rival, and completely flops like many other ecological world-building points when it reaches the recess. Sunbreak doesn't have this, but it does have the Risens, who can provide an alright challenge in the Elders, but mainly provide stat-buffed chores in the earlier roster with obnoxious AoEs. With Ichihara leaving the series after Iceborne, it's unknown if Suzuki will return for Wild's Ultimate, or if someone new will arise. How Wild's expansion will play out is anyone's guess. Whilst Wild's roster is plenty diverse, it does also have a big spike of a certain class, which is Leviathans, having as many Leviathans as World did Fanged Wyverns, and more Leviathans than Tri. And I think this shows something about how Mainline, or possibly how Takuda does things, in that he simply likes batch creating monsters to make multiple variations on a theme. Takuda was also the one to create the DOS Monkey Trio, with the three presenting a sliding scale of difficulty and tricks, each one preparing you for the next, but while still being different enough to not feel like copy and pastes, like the Raptors. Back then, it could be tempting to say this was due to budgets, and having to wring the most out of newly made skeletons, but with this approach still prevalent in World and more so Wilds, it does just seem he likes to make a lot of the same type at once. This was also the case with the Fanged Wyverns for World, and these two groups do have something in common in that they were relatively neglected in prior generations. Fanged Wyverns only had one monster in Zinogre, and whilst Leviathans had been going reasonably strong, they hadn't had a single place in a mainline game for 2 generations straight. It's no wonder Takuda had so many built up over the years to unleash all at once. I think the question of who comes back and why are always good discussion points in the build up to a new game, and the devs have given us some reasons for who gets in and who doesn't. Obviously Rathalos and Rathian are a given, so the presence of Diablos in Tri is one to ponder. In World, Diablos was brought back due to being the definitive master of the sands, so maybe this was the case for Tri as well. For 4U, as a desert monster, it joins Monoblos and Cephadrome in returning for Sandborn. Plesioth is surprisingly the reason for 3 Ultimate, and it is a little surprising he wasn't just in base Tri. But as the definitive swimming monster of the first 2 generations, he did lead to a fandom favourite being made, and was an obvious choice to bring back in that regard. It is occasionally surprising and heartwarming in equal measures to hear how specific monsters that aren't flagships, final bosses, or other hype monsters still get brought up in such discussions, and how it feels even the underdogs don't go as forgotten as one may fear. Gravios is also quite interesting too. Fujioka has said before he makes Tigrex like Tigrex, having him charge all over the map, and this is why he was in 4U's demo due to being used to test the new ledges and vertical maps with his movement. In this same way, Gravios may be Fujioka's test dummy for new combat features. In 4U, Gravios gets a ton of part breaks that can only be achieved with the new feature of mounting, more so than any other monster in the game. Similarly, in Wilds, Gravios was returned for similar reasons, to test a monster with the more precise weapon damage mechanics that allow you to break and then target broken areas. So it seems whenever a monster is needed to test some new fighting mechanic revolving around part breaks, Gravios is the one chosen. Kutku is famously known as Sensei, and is back in Wilds as both a greeter for high rank and as a monster used to test monster packs, intended to be a fresh start to break players in with an updated face. And this is a nice role for him. Your Kutku isn't my Kutku, as my Kutku is first-gen Deathlord Kutku, but this is still an admirable attempt to return him to a similar status. On this note, Congalala's return is surprisingly to essentially style him as Wild's Anjanath to a degree. One of Anjanath's roles in World was the first exam, essentially a test of all you've learned so far against other monsters, against a strong, versatile monster with an elemental ability. On World, Fujioka said in hindsight they believed Great Jagras was too broad a monster in terms of its fight, with a lot of mechanics going into it like ranged attacks and the bloated state. So rather, Chatacabra and Chemetries were intended to be focused melee and broad area of effect fights respectively, with Lalabarina presumably being an ailment-based fight to round off the trio before Congalala, who has elements of all of the first 3. This is good game structure, even if it's debatable that Great Jagras was too much for anyone due to his fight. To consider other candidates too, Gypsaros, Kurapiko and Daimyo would likely introduce too many gimmicks for this role, and Tetsukabra lacks the area of effect moves. It's hard to tell exactly who could come back in future, as it's not imminently clear what the developer goals are for certain games, and a lot of fandom suggestions can often be short-sighted. Surprised as to why Magnamarlo, Deviljho or Basiljuice aren't in the game for the sole reason they now have entire herds of Karatanoth they can be shown killing, spring to mind. But it's worth noting too, as of Wilds, just how many monsters have been given a next-gen facelift. Of the rank and file, it's mainly just the first-gen Raptors, Piscines and Monoblos, a lot of Tries lower tiers and Ignactor, and then a good deal of 4th gen. Of these, some feel they have more to offer than others. Kurapiko's gimmick would make him a good pick for any game focused on monster-monster interactions, which does make his absence a little surprising so far. Similarly, with water combat often on the developers' minds, Gobel is simply lying in wait for its return. Giganox is harder to call, as its role as a mid to early game poison monster isn't an exclusive one, and it's also dependent on caves to return, which would make it a natural pick for the Iceshard Cliffs despite still being missing. It does seem as if Nursilla and Gypsaros have stolen Giganox's potential role, Nursilla being the creepy cave predator with her young joining in the fight, Gypsaros adding the poison and their combined relationship sprucing the two with an ecological slant. Other monsters may just get by on luck too. The first-gen Raptors add essentially nothing that can't be done by someone else, and are in the coveted starter slot. However, Ichinose's overstuffed early games may provide their salvation. If Rise started with the Grades, Portable 6th may well start with the Dromes. Much of 4th gen's missing monsters feel the same. They don't do anything that feels like it specifically excludes them, but they also don't have specific gimmicks that'd feel like they'd bind them to the specific theme of a certain game. Monoblos feels like it really has little chance outside of what would essentially be stunt casting, as there's nothing really it does that Diablos doesn't also do but with 4 players, in a series that's more and more about online play. Similarly, much of the lore people like about Monoblos is essentially their own headcanons. Cephadrome is in a similar boat, in that he's an unpopular monster in an unpopular class whose role as a sand swimmer is repeatedly being remade with progressively better monsters. Even Portable feels like it may not save Cephadrome, with Nibelsnarf being the more likely pick. With Uthduna having a much more enjoyable but also water-themed fight, it's hard not to ignore the notion Piscines have been replaced by Leviathans. But Plesioth's bind to water and potential combat would give it a stronger chance for the future in that regard. To start winding the video down, I'm not above some idle speculation. So with this approach, who could potentially be next for a class revitalization as Takuda seems to like doing? The assorted invertebrate classes are an option. If you pull all 3 groups, there's only one more than the Fanged Wyverns, and individually there are just 2 crabs, 4 Neopterans and 3 Temnesirans from the rank and file. It's often claimed that Frontier's Scorpion wasn't made a flagship, due to concerns over how well an invertebrate flagship would sell. And of the buggy monsters, the highest ranked in the popularity poll was Vespid Queen at 82nd. But of those who weren't meme votes, it was Celtus Queen at 104th. Despite the quality of invertebrate monsters, and the endless whining of the fanbase about flagship repetition and roster diversity, they ultimately failed to show any love for the bugs when it arguably mattered. Similarly, Temnosirans aren't just arthropod-inspired, they're specifically spider-inspired, and there's still a lot you can do with spiders, who are themselves a very diverse group. But getting several more at once may not be too likely for such a niche group. But popularity and perceived charisma aren't the only things that matter. The devs can just do whatever they like, and whilst perhaps less likely than some other classes, either Temnesirans or Carapacions could be due for a big update. A much more likely candidate could be amphibians. Takuda was the one to bring amphibians into the limelight, and they're still a pretty small class with just 4 members. They're also a very versatile class. With gliding frogs and wall-sticking frogs, there's still a lot you can do with frogs alone. To say nothing of mixing it up with earlier developmental stages like tadpoles, or other amphibians like newts or salamanders. Or indeed mixing other animals or fantastical concepts into base frogs to make things like Zamtrios the sharky balloon frog, or Chatacabra the gorilla frog. They are overall a pretty malleable class that can be placed anywhere in a roster, and in multiple different maps, and could potentially be the next for an update. Quite a surprising option could be the aforementioned Piscines too. Many may be shocked to hear that Duratodus was the first Piscine made since 1st gen, and that the whole class only actually has 5 members without subspecies. Poor reception and a lack of fight diversity have long plagued this class, and it's also no secret the world's piscines were essentially rushed in, due to the fact they couldn't get Leviathans working in that game. You can definitely argue it's not a great sign for the future of the class that their own creator essentially didn't want to make them. And nor has anyone else with the fact they went 3 generations without an update, and the generation before that was the introductory one for the whole series. But if anything could boost piscine diversity and give a reason to make more of them, and amphibians for that matter too, it could well be water combat. I do think the fanbase doesn't, or maybe didn't, talk enough about how the developers didn't really try to hide the fact they wanted water combat back for World, and spent considerable time trying to bring it back, albeit without success. But in a moment where you can tell fragments of this video were written before Wilds, Lagarcrus's return really does show that it's still in the developers' heads, and they really want to bring it back. This won't be a video to get into the pros and cons of water combat, though I am pro for it. And most con videos I've seen seem to make the brain-dead conclusion of, it was bad in 3rd gen so therefore we should never even try it again. But it is worth discussing briefly in terms of the future if Capcom have shown an interest in bringing it back. Some may argue the series is past water combat. After all, Takuda has now made 2 maps that revolve around the concept of the sea on land. Arguably 3 if you include the fact the Rotten Vale was inspired by whale falls. And with a cephalopod class, he's now also successfully made a group of monsters based off animals synonymous with being under the sea as entirely land-based fights to considerable fanfare and success. But the main argument for water combat isn't New Udra, rather it's Uthduna. So long as monsters and maps exist with water-based mechanics, there will be the undeniable feeling that we should be able to pursue them into their environment. Just from skimming comments, I think it's fair to say that Uth was the poorest received Wild's Apex. And the fact she essentially needs a big cut-off pull to herself to actually use her ultimate attack the hunter can just walk away from is pretty awkward. Plesioth is near universally agreed to be at its best when you can hunt him in the water too. And it does just seem to be the case that so long as there are water-based monsters, they'll only be at their best if the hunter can swim as well. Again, just look at Lagarcrus's reception in Wilds. On top of this, there's the argument for maps and ecology too. You can definitely argue Capcom should have waited to make water combat, because once it's out there, you're not going to get people to stop talking about it, as it's simply that big a thing. What's more, you also can't devote games to ecology as Takuda says is his goals, then ignore both one of the most crucial factors in what allows life to spring forth, and create several unique biomes itself. With several generations of camera and combat mechanics to allow better for things like water combat to happen, I say to start leading the copium charge for 7th gen, and Monster Hunter Dive now. Thanks for watching. And thanks as ever to my patrons, Bonecrusher Hyena, Toxic Wolf, The Super Stuper, DJ, My Best Friend Loba, Samburgo, K Sandom, Octavia of the 5th Fleet, Nickname 3110, Kieran McCarthy, Flygon's Archives, Hui Hui, Jabin, The Belted Horned Warbler, Roberto Hernandez, Big Man Blastoise, Nathan Cross, Johnny, Oni, Tim Kojira, Teddy KGB, Insert Nickname, Waffle, Slashmaster 101, Dapper Raptor, Godzilla Prime 2, Original Username, Small Squid, Litton Gamer 111, Evilly, Howleth, Archerzor Queen, Tommy Choi, Jacob Wilcox, Seth Fake Last Name, Dodecablos, and Bazugazu Bakumatsu, who keep the channel going with their generosity, and especially during the time that I busted my laptop charger, but now we are so back. So thank you for sticking through the wait, and also through my voice giving out in parts of this video. I had wanted to natter about the rosters for some time, and I think it really is worth noting how rosters all slot together, and how it can make the progression of a game feel so pleasing. On top of all that, I also had some thoughts on a lot of various games and monsters I wanted to expunge, and so there was no better place than this video. Certainly, some of my views are coloured only by having played Western releases. For You is a game I've only ever played as an Ultimate Edition, whereas with most of the others there's a contrast between base and Ultimate that adds to discussion. Naturally, this topic will also slant more towards mainline too, as they generally craft theirs more meticulously and with a lot less returner bloat than portable. I should also add the thoughts on 4th gen aren't just slander, as I did also used to think 4U was the best old Monster Hunter game. Now I'm not sure if any old gen game can really be awarded that title, as they're all just trying to do different things. But I do think the treatment of its roster can feel quite rudderless compared to other games. I'm also very aware this is quite a personal video. This was essentially just an hour or two of me expunging a lot of my thoughts. You will have your own, and they likely will be different. Anyways, after this, things will be more back on schedule as usual. After a spell of non-Monster Hunter videos, the next ones will be back to species analysis videos, so be sure to check out the Patreon to vote on who will be featured first.